It was a crisp Friday morning in Washington, D.C., and the atmosphere in the Oval Office was thick with anticipation. President Trump had invited Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy for what was supposed to be a ceremonial meeting. An opportunity to discuss ongoing relations between their two nations. The press had gathered, cameras poised, reporters murmuring in hushed excitement, and senior White House officials stood strategically around the room, ready to interject if necessary. Among them was Vice President JD Vance, who had seen his fair share of high-stakes meetings but had no idea that this one was about to take a wild turn. Trump, known for his love of media spectacles, welcomed Zelenskyy with a broad smile, shaking his hand firmly. "Great to have you here, President Zelenskyy. Big day, big conversations, a lot of people watching. Tremendous energy in the room," he declared, his voice booming with characteristic confidence. Zelenskyy, standing a few inches shorter but holding himself with a soldier's resolve, nodded politely. "Thank you, Mr. President. It is important for us to be here. Ukraine values its relationship with the United States." For the first 25 to 30 minutes, the discussion went as expected. Trump was engaging, diplomatic, and even complimentary towards his Ukrainian counterpart, despite some pointed remarks from Zelenskyy about U.S. support and funding. Vance observed from the side, his hands clasped in front of him, taking mental notes. He had been in similar meetings before, where the president would handle foreign dignitaries with a mix of flattery, dominance, and showmanship. He had also seen Trump tolerate a fair share of criticism, but there was a fine line between diplomacy and provocation. The first sign of trouble came when a Polish journalist raised his hand and asked a question regarding the peace negotiations with Russia. Trump, ever eager to control the narrative, answered first. He reaffirmed his commitment to ending the war, stating, "We want the killing to stop. We want peace. Everybody wants peace, but you have to have the right deal, the smart deal. And some people don't want that." Then, as Vance later recalled with a mixture of amusement and disbelief, it was his turn to speak. He provided a measured response, outlining why the U.S. believed negotiations were critical at this stage. His words, while firm, were not inflammatory, at least. He hadn't thought so at the time. But something in his tone or phrasing set Zelenskyy off. The Ukrainian president's expression hardened. His body language changed from polite engagement to visible frustration. Then, in front of the cameras, he turned to Vance and fired back with an impassioned counter-argument. Vance, momentarily caught off guard, blinked. He glanced at Trump, expecting the president to step in. Instead, Trump leaned back slightly in his chair, an almost amused smirk forming on his lips, as if to say, "All right, let's see how this plays out. So you're saying Ukraine should compromise?" Zelenskyy challenged, his voice rising. "We are fighting for our survival, for our land, and you expect us to simply sit at a table while Russia continues its aggression?" His impassioned plea sent a ripple through the room. Some of the American officials looked at each other uncomfortably. The reporters leaned in, sensing a headline-worthy moment. Vance cleared his throat, trying to navigate the situation delicately. "Mr. President, no one is asking Ukraine to surrender. The goal is to find a sustainable resolution, one that prevents further loss of life while ensuring Ukraine's sovereignty." Zelenskyy, however, was not in a mood to be placated. "You speak of peace, but what peace is there when your enemy refuses to negotiate in good faith?" He gestured animatedly. "You tell me, Mr. Vice President, would you negotiate with someone who has invaded your home, taken your land, and threatened your people?" At this moment, Trump, still leaning back, finally interjected, "Well, let's be fair, Volodymyr. Some deals get made when people don't like each other very much. It's called business." He chuckled. "You know, I've dealt with some tough people in real estate. Tough guys, tougher than Putin, even. And guess what? You make a deal, you shake hands, and you move forward." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone processed the comparison of war negotiations to high-stakes real estate deals. Vance fought the urge to facepalm. Zelenskyy, looking utterly unimpressed, took a deep breath as if deciding whether to engage further. Then, with visible effort, he composed himself and replied, "With respect, Mr. President, Ukraine is not a real estate deal." Trump waved his hand. Sure, but the principle is the same. You got to know when to hold him, when to fold him." He looked around, clearly pleased with himself. Great song, by the way. Kenny Rogers. Classic. Vance took the opportunity to try and steer things back on track. Perhaps we can continue this discussion privately, he suggested, sensing that any further public confrontation would only escalate tensions. A more productive setting. But before he could finish, Trump raised a finger. Actually, you know what? No, let's have this conversation right here. Let the American people see what's going on. Transparency. We love transparency, don't we, folks? At this point, several White House aides were shifting uncomfortably. The meeting had officially gone off the rails. What was meant to be a diplomatic handshake event had turned into a live debate. And Trump was clearly enjoying the show. Zelenskyy looked at Trump, then at Vance, and then at the cameras. He exhaled sharply. If we are to continue, he said slowly, then I need to know that the United States truly stands with Ukraine. That we are not seen as just another deal to be negotiated. Trump nodded. Of course, we stand with Ukraine. We love Ukraine. Great people. Fantastic people. But we also love peace. And, frankly, I think you should sit down with Putin and figure this thing out. The Ukrainian president rubbed his temple. The tension in the room had reached new heights. Vance, still trying to maintain some semblance of diplomacy, decided to attempt humor to lighten the mood. Mr. President, he said, turning to Trump, I don't suppose you'd like to go to Kyiv yourself and personally broker this deal? I hear they have great hotels. Trump perked up. Well, you know, a Trump hotel in Kyiv, now that's an idea. Would be tremendous. Best hotel in Ukraine. People would love it. Maybe we'd talk about that after the war. Huh? Zelenskyy blinked. Vance sighed internally. And somewhere in the room, a White House staffer probably considered submitting their resignation letter. Ultimately, the meeting ended without resolution. Zelenskyy, after making one last attempt to continue discussions, was politely shown out. Trump, still in good spirits, turned to Vance and said, that was something. Huh? We should do this more often. Ratings must be through the roof. Vance, with a mixture of amusement and exasperation, simply nodded. Yes, Mr. President, quite the show indeed. As the press conference continued, JD Vance could feel the tension in the room thickening. The initial 25 to 30 minutes had gone as expected. President Trump, as was his style, engaged the press openly, fielding questions with his usual bravado. Zelenskyy, on the other hand, was a mix of composed and defensive, subtly needling Trump with statements that Vance felt were not entirely accurate. But Trump, to Vance's slight surprise, remained diplomatic, a quality he knew the president could exhibit when he deemed it necessary. Then came the moment when everything went off the rails. It started innocuously enough. A Polish journalist posed a question. Trump answered. Vance, feeling it was an appropriate time to add his perspective, followed up. What happened next was the diplomatic equivalent of lighting a match in a room filled with gasoline. Zelenskyy's demeanor shifted almost instantly. His face, which had previously held a practiced expression of politeness, tensed up. He leaned slightly forward, a telltale sign of someone gearing up for confrontation. You're BL. Zelenskyy shot at Vance. Vance blinked, momentarily confused. BL? Was this some kind of new political acronym he hadn't been briefed on? Bureaucratic liability? Budget loser? Before he could ask for clarification, Zelenskyy launched into a rapid-fire retort, his voice growing sharper with every word. The diplomatic pleasantries were officially over. Vance, for his part, had not walked into the Oval Office that day expecting to engage in verbal jousting with the president of Ukraine. But here they were. He glanced at Trump, expecting perhaps a signal to de-escalate. But the president was watching with the unmistakable expression of a man who had just found his new favorite TV show. Realizing that an argument in front of 100 TV cameras wasn't exactly the preferred protocol, Vance attempted to defuse the situation. He leaned back, raised his hands in a placating manner, and said, maybe we should take this conversation private. Trump, who had been silently observing the back and forth like a seasoned boxing promoter, interjected, nope, actually, I don't want to have it in private anymore. Let's have this conversation in public. The American people should see this. Vance barely had time to process Trump's declaration before Zelenskyy fired another round of grievances. It was as if every irritation, Every frustration the Ukrainian president had been harboring had suddenly found an outlet. Vance, who had spent years in politics and had seen his fair share of fiery exchanges, wasn't entirely thrown off, but there was something uniquely surreal about standing in the most powerful office in the world, on live television, arguing with a foreign leader while Trump egged it on like a reality show host. The press, naturally, was having the time of their lives. The cameras zoomed in, the reporters scribbled frantically. This was the kind of drama that fueled 24-hour news cycles for weeks. As the argument continued, Vance tried once more to bring things back to a more productive path. Look, we can go back and forth all day. But the president's policy is clear. He wants the killing to stop. That's the goal. That's what we should be discussing. Zelenskyy, still visibly agitated, crossed his arms. And what do you propose? Before Vance could answer, Trump jumped in. I propose that you stop arguing with my VP and start talking about peace. Okay? That would be tremendous. Really tremendous. Zelenskyy exhaled sharply, clearly weighing his next words. The back and forth had reached a point where continuing it would likely lead to diminishing returns. He adjusted his posture, signaling, albeit begrudgingly, that he was willing to move forward, at least for now. Trump clapped his hands together. Great, now that's settled. Let's get back to making deals. Shall we? Vance, rubbing his temples discreetly, made a mental note to never again underestimate just how quickly things could go sideways in a Trump-led meeting. And judging by the smirk playing at the corner of Trump's mouth, the president had enjoyed every second of it. Meanwhile, a White House intern, standing off to the side, whispered to another staffer, I thought international diplomacy was supposed to be boring. The staffer shook their head, watching as Trump leaned back in his chair, looking pleased. Not in this administration. And with that, the meeting pressed on, with Vance still trying to shake off the feeling that he had somehow stumbled into an unreleased episode of The Apprentice, Global Politics Edition. The unexpected diplomatic duel. As JD Vance settled into his chair, still absorbing the unexpected fireworks from the Trump-Zelenskyy meeting, he couldn't help but reflect on how rapidly things had escalated. One moment, it was a formal, almost ceremonial affair, a simple acknowledgement of mutual interests. The next, it had turned into a full-blown diplomatic showdown, complete with sharp exchanges, veiled insults, and an outright dismissal of the Ukrainian delegation. Vance took a deep breath and chuckled to himself. Who knew being vice president would be this much of an adventure? Maybe he should start carrying popcorn to these meetings. The moment it went off the rails. To truly understand what had happened, Vance rewound his memory to the exact moment everything went south. The press conference had been running smoothly for a while, at least. As smoothly as anything involving Trump could be. The president had been gracious, even diplomatic, trying his best to maintain a cordial tone despite some pointed remarks from Zelenskyy. Then came the question from a Polish journalist. It was a fair inquiry, one that any experienced statesman should have been prepared for. Trump answered first, keeping his response relatively measured. Then, it was Vance's turn. All right, here we go, he thought as he leaned forward and started speaking. What he hadn't anticipated was that his answer would set Zelenskyy off like a firecracker on the 4th of July. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. Zelenskyy's facial expression morphed from a carefully controlled mask of diplomacy into barely contained irritation. Then, before anyone could blink, the Ukrainian president launched into a fiery rebuttal, his voice rising with every sentence. Trump, who had been watching with amusement, leaned back and grinned. Well, this just got interesting. Vance, sensing that things were heating up, tried to de-escalate the situation. Look, Mr. President, he said, perhaps we should discuss this matter in private. We don't want the media to. But Trump, ever the showman, waved a hand dismissively. Nah, let's do this right here. Let the American people see what's going on. Vance sighed internally. Of course, Trump would want this to play out in front of cameras. The entitlement factor. As the argument unfolded, Vance began noticing something peculiar. Zelenskyy wasn't just frustrated, he seemed genuinely entitled. It was as if he expected the U.S. to unconditionally support Ukraine. No questions asked, no negotiations necessary. At one point, Zelenskyy scoffed. You Americans act as if you're doing us a favor. But let's be honest, this is in your interest too. Trump raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? Vance knew this was about to go downhill fast. Trying to rein things in, he attempted again. Mr. President, what we're saying is, but Zelenskyy wasn't done. You're talking about peace talks. But Putin is the one who invaded. How do you negotiate with someone who wants to destroy your country? Trump nodded. Fair point. But, and I mean this with all due respect, what's your endgame here? How long do you think this can keep going? Silence. Vance could practically hear the gears turning in Zelenskyy's head. But instead of answering, the Ukrainian president simply folded his arms and stared at them. His frustration evident. Trump sighed. See, this is what I mean. If you're not willing to talk, what's the alternative? Just keep fighting forever? More silence. Vance took the opportunity to jump in. Look, we're not saying roll over and surrender. We're saying there has to be a realistic pathway forward. A war without an end goal is just destruction for the sake of destruction. Zelenskyy exhaled sharply. And what would you have us do? Shake hands with Putin like nothing happened? Trump smirked. Hey, I shook hands with Kim Jong-un. Didn't I? That moment of levity might have eased the tension, except that Zelenskyy did not find it funny. The aftermath. As the meeting finally wrapped up, and the Ukrainian delegation was unceremoniously sent on their way, Vance couldn't help but feel that they had just witnessed a pivotal moment. Zelenskyy had been given a clear message. The US wasn't going to write blank checks forever. Back in his office, Vance leaned back in his chair and sighed. He had a feeling this wasn't the last time he'd be dealing with this situation. Trump strolled in, grabbing a Diet Coke from the mini fridge. Well, that was something, huh? Vance chuckled. Yeah, Mr. President, definitely something. Trump took a sip and grinned. I think we should charge pay-per-view for these meetings. Could make a fortune. Vance laughed. Honestly? You might be onto something. As they sat there, the weight of the situation settled in. The path forward was uncertain. But one thing was clear. Diplomacy under Trump's leadership was never going to be boring. The fallout and the next move. Backlash and media frenzy. As the news of the Trump-Zelenskyy meeting spread like wildfire, the media exploded with reactions. Every major news network dissected the confrontation. From the tense exchanges to Trump's offhanded jokes about pay-per-view diplomacy. Headlines ranged from, Trump humiliates Zelenskyy in live showdown, to, U.S. signal shift in Ukraine policy. Pundits debated whether this was a calculated move or yet another example of Trump's unconventional style. In the White House press room, JD Vance found himself fielding an onslaught of questions. Reporters demanded clarity. Was the U.S. withdrawing support for Ukraine? Was Trump attempting to force peace talks with Putin? Did the administration believe Zelenskyy was being unreasonable? Vance, maintaining his usual calm, responded in careful terms, emphasizing that the U.S. remained committed to aiding its allies, but that the administration was reassessing long-term strategy. Trump, on the other hand, had no such reservations. During an impromptu interview with Fox News, he grinned and said, "Listen, folks, we love Ukraine. Great country. Wonderful people. But let's be real. We can't just keep throwing money at a war with no end in sight. We're not running a charity." Cue another media meltdown. The global reactions. As expected, Ukraine was furious. Zelenskyy's team quickly issued a statement condemning Trump's remarks, calling them a betrayal of democratic values. European leaders scrambled to respond, some expressing concern over what appeared to be a major shift in U.S. policy. NATO allies privately panicked, wondering if America's reduced enthusiasm for indefinite support meant they would have to pick up the slack. Putin, meanwhile, had a field day. The Kremlin released a statement dripping with sarcasm, commending the U.S. for its pragmatic reassessment of the situation. Russian state media mocked Zelenskyy's performance, with one commentator remarking, "Perhaps President Zelenskyy should learn that demanding billions isn't a great diplomatic strategy." China, never one to miss an opportunity, subtly weighed in. An editorial in Global Times noted, "The United States is finally realizing what China has long understood: endless war benefits no one." Perhaps Washington should focus on diplomacy instead of military intervention. It was a calculated move, hinting at a potential shift in global power dynamics. The internal debate. Back in Washington, the Republican Party found itself split. The MAGA faction cheered Trump's performance, seeing it as a long overdue rejection of the blank check policy for Ukraine. Establishment conservatives, however, were uneasy. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell issued a carefully worded statement reaffirming support for Ukraine, subtly distancing himself from Trump's stance. Democrats, unsurprisingly, pounced on the controversy. President Biden, speaking at a campaign event, slammed Trump's handling of the meeting. Abandoning our allies? That's not leadership. That's cowardice. Vance, meanwhile, found himself in the middle of the storm. While he largely agreed with Trump's position, he recognized the need for damage control. Sitting in the Oval Office, he laid it out bluntly. Mr. President, we need to clarify the message. If we're pulling back support, we need a defined strategy. If we're negotiating, we need a framework. Trump waved a hand. Relax, JD. We're not abandoning anyone. We're just telling Zelenskyy to start thinking about an exit strategy. Vance sighed. I get that, but if we don't control the narrative, our enemies will. Trump leaned back, smirking. So control it. That's why I've got you. A new approach? As the dust settled, Vance knew the administration had to make its next move carefully. The world was watching. Allies were nervous, and enemies were emboldened. Whether this was a strategic masterstroke or a disastrous blunder remained to be seen. For now, one thing was certain. The Trump administration had changed the conversation. And in the world of politics, that was sometimes half the battle. The behind-the-scenes negotiations. While the media storm raged, behind closed doors, negotiations were underway. Vance reached out to key European allies, reassuring them that the U.S. was not abandoning Ukraine but was instead seeking a realistic path toward resolution. Some leaders, particularly in France and Germany, expressed quiet relief. Many in Europe had begun questioning the sustainability of an indefinite conflict but had been hesitant to say so publicly. Meanwhile, Trump's team initiated back-channel discussions with Russian intermediaries. The goal was to gauge whether there was any real possibility for a negotiated ceasefire or if Putin was simply playing for time. The Kremlin's response was predictable. Russia was open to talks, but only on its terms. Zelenskyy, however, was unwilling to entertain negotiations under the current conditions. In a defiant speech, he declared, "Ukraine will fight to the last man if necessary. We do not negotiate with aggressors who still occupy our land." The impasse remained, but the dynamics had shifted. The world now knew that America was no longer willing to bankroll the war indefinitely. And that alone was enough to set new political calculations in motion. The next test. As Vance left another tense meeting in the Situation Room, he knew the administration's next challenge was approaching fast. Congress was about to vote on a new aid package for Ukraine, and the results would be a litmus test for the shifting political winds. Would America continue its full-throated support for Kyiv, or had Trump successfully changed the trajectory? One thing was certain, whatever came next, it wouldn't be boring.